Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the 19th chapter. We're going to make it all the way up to the first 15 verses, but we just want to cover a few verses in the 18th chapter, beginning with verses 2 through 4. And Yahweh called a little child to him and put him in their midst, and said, Truly I say to you, unless you turn and become as little children, you shall by no means enter into the kingdom of the heaven. Whoever then humbles himself as this little child is the greatest in the kingdom of the heaven. Therein we learn that a childlike spirit and attitude is an absolute prerequisite for salvation. Herein we have to distinguish and qualify the difference between childish and childlike. Childishness is a vice to be avoided by the plague. Paul speaks of this in 1 Corinthians 14:20. A childlike spirit is what we're going after for. That's what's necessary for our salvation. A child is an artless, instinctual believer. We are to be as humble and reliant and dependent as on our good shepherd as we are sheep and children. And that is the spirit we must approach our good shepherd who leads us into the green waters of salvation, and humility is the key. So the paradox is that he who humbles himself shall be made the greatest in the kingdom of the heaven. So we have to, the process of coming to God demands, and learning more about him demands unlearning much of what we have already learned. We have to approach it with a blank slate, and may we never lose sight of the born again prompting which began it, and lose the integrity of that. We have to be constantly born, not only born again, but reborn again. So the artist Pablo Picasso claimed that he could paint like Raphael by the age of 15, and he spent the rest of his life learning to paint like a child. We have to be the same way as believers. We have to always approach our Maker in a childlike spirit and attitude if we hope to make it back to his presence. Verse 11, For the Son of Man has come to save what is lost. That is his purpose. That is his mission statement. Son of Man is a messianic title, and the entire reason the divinity assumed the mortal frame and became flesh and walked among us was to save, not to judge. We read of in John 3:16. And to be lost is to be in need of salvation. So the whole world is lost in darkness and self, and they have no direction and no compass and no shepherd. But the good shepherd condescends, in the positive theological term sense of the word. He condescends from heaven to seek and save that which is lost and bring them to their heavenly homeland. And verse 20, For where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, there I am in the midst. A church, a fellowship is seriously that simple. It's just a plurality, and Christianity is, Christian must spend many times alone, and they must spend times in solitude and contemplation. But when they gather with the brethren, there too is he in the midst, inasmuch as we are authentic brethren. So this language, I feel, has been corrupted by churchese, which is the language that triples down to the lost sinner, which in all objective honesty form the majority of the professed church. But where 2 or 3 are there, so too is he. He is literally as close as the mention of his name, and that's all it takes. So a lot of churches who may be struggling with numbers right now, worry not, he is there with you. And the remainder of the chapter consists of the parable of the unmerciful servant, a servant of the king who was forgiven an astronomical, inestimable, incalculable debt. And then the first thing he does upon being received, he throws himself at the feet of his master and says, Master, please forgive me, give times. And he is not only given time, but absolved of the debt. Then a lesser servant comes to him, tells him the exact same thing, and he cast him into debtor's prison for a debt that was infinitesimal in amount to the incalculable one that he owed his master. And when his king found out, he said, Wicked servant, I forgave you all that debt, seeing you begged me. So he had begged him in the same manner that the one who had begged him. And we are all beggars, no matter how rich or ruler. We must all beg for our salvation and pray perpetually. Should you not also have mercy on your fellow servant, as I also had mercy on you? Mercy, we read in Matthew, blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy, Matthew 5:9. So mercy is far too precious a commodity to waste on the unmerciful, as we read here in the parable of the unmerciful servant whose king was merciful towards him, but his mercy has limits, and the king is prefigured. He is typologically alluded to as the heavenly king, the God who extends mercy, but has mercy on whom he has mercy. And if we don't have mercy ourselves for our fellow man, his mercy he's not gonna share it with us. We have no reason or expectation. And the final verse, so also my Father of the heaven shall do to you, each of you, if your heart does not forgive his brother his trespasses. So forgiveness, mercy, et al., etc. are far too precious commodities to waste on those who lack them. These are blessings and treasures that become curses when they are given to men who live life as curses and make curses out of blessings and corrupt and distort gifts of their makers. They are alienated from the giver, but they enjoy the gift, which is tantamount to idolatry. So the opening verse of the 19th chapter, remember the 19th chapter, there are two parts, the first of which he addresses the controversy and question of divorce as presented to him by the Pharisees, and then he also reaffirms what we read of in the 18th chapter early, his affection and esteem and regard, and the educational value and the just general treasure that children truly are. So the opening verse in the 19th chapter reads, and it came to pass when Yahweh had ended these words that he left Galilee and came to the borders of Judah beyond Jordan. So he's in a different geographical location from when he uttered these words. He is now in Judah. Galilee was to the north of Samaria, which was to the north of Judah, but he was beyond the Jordan. That was the western extremity of the promised land. So this is the where he is, and the when it is after he had spoken what he's spoken in this words. And large crowds followed him, and he healed them there. So one of the reasons that he was attracting such large crowds was because there was a lot of sick people in need of his healing touch, and all it took for him was an act of faith. There was no amount of sin or demon possession that could come across his healing redemptive touch or his healing hand. Physical sickness, spiritual sickness, he is master of the spirit and the earth and the cosmos. So there is nothing that his redemptive reach cannot touch and cannot transform and cannot heal. And the Pharisees came to him, trying him, and saying to him, is it right for a man to put away his verse for every reason? So the first thing we notice right here is it's the Pharisees who are asking him. And whenever we read the Pharisees in the word Pharisees in the New Testament, alarm bells ring in our ear. We go, uh-oh, here goes trouble, here goes confrontation. And we immediately get the affirmation of that assumption when they came to him, tempting him or trying him. This is technically blasphemy. So their question was not answered with honest intent. They were trying to trap him, to expose him as a lawbreaker according to indict him. And the question, the device and the ploy that they tried to use it was a question that was written in Deuteronomy 24 verses 1 through 4. The law of Moses did permit divorce, and the way it reads is that if a man's wife displeases him and pollutes and defiles him, and there were two schools of thought revolving around the two sections of that when we get to them. And actually, we don't have enough time in the way. So there were two prominent rabbinical theologians at the time, Hillel and Shammai, and one of them was more liberal and one of them was more conservative. And the more conservative interpreted the first one. If a man should displease his husband for any reason, bake his food wrong, displease him, upset him in any way, shape, or form, he had permission to divorce him. But the more conservative camp, and this is the one that Yahshua re-endorses in verse 9, but before that he goes back all the way to Eden. We'll read of that when we read of that. But he said when he should defile herself or pollute herself. So according to the law, there was an adulterous connotation. Divorce was a necessary evil to eliminate the rule for adultery. And adultery, strictly speaking, according to the Mosaic law, was a capital offense, subjectable to be thrown to stone to death, but the typical matter, the typical procedure was to divorce one's wife, not stone them publicly. So the law of the letter was not always obeyed, such as we witness, for instance, in the 8th chapter of John's verse, when they bring an adulteress in him, asking him that telling him that the law of Moses demand that she be stoned. How does he read the law? First off, it takes two to tangle, but that's a whole different story entirely. We're just going to read verse 4. And he answering and said to them, Did you not read that he who made them at the beginning made them male and female? So he knows they're familiar with Deuteronomy. He's trying to bring it back to where it all began in beginning, the Genesis creation. He who made them is he who made male and female, the human species. We are products of creation, and it happened at the beginning, the 6th day of the beginning. We can read of this. We are the esteem and the honor and the dominant species of the planet through his grace, and we alone have the image or the capacity to have fellowship, but we also have agency. But that gets us into Genesis. We want to stick to this. For he said, For this cause a man shall leave his father and mother, and join unto his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So with those words did Yahweh sanctify the original marriage, which became institutionalized, and the concept was born, and the practice was implemented in the Garden of Eden between the first married couple, Adam and Eve. And when they were married, when they were joined together, it was almost instant. She was created to him as a helpmate. So he noticed that Adam wandered the earth, that something was missing. He had this paradise, but he lacked a human companion, more specifically a female human companion through whom he could enjoy life more with. And that was the entire reason they were to be married, was to be happy. And marriage is a challenge, which happiness is not automatic or not anything like that, but it does take work. But it really, divorce is a necessary evil which arose in response to evil. So since the first married couple lived and loved each other, a lot of married couples, the plain fact, the cold, unsentimental fact is that a lot of married couples have not loved their spouses. And he said, and the two shall become one flesh. Verse 5, and he said, For this, so this is the reason that a child leaves his parents, was to get married, and the two shall become one flesh. They shall, strictly speaking, cease to be individuals, but have their identity enwrapped in each other. So they will, strictly speaking, cease being two beings. They will become one. They will be equal. They will be united. They will be one flesh. That is the purpose for marriage, not divorce. So he's telling them they're missing the entire meaning of the message. They're missing the big picture. Divorce is not how one ought to think of marriage, and many people who enter into our marriage in our day and age have a divorce insurance policy in the back of their mind, but we just want to stick to the story we're supposed to be reading. So that they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore what Elohim hath joined together, let man not separate. So divorce is possible, but it's not approved. It's not endorsed. It's not invited. It's not encouraged. It is possible. It's a necessary evil to prevent greater evils, such as being continually engaged with a chronic adulteress or an adulterer. That is the reason divorce was created. So when they are not two flesh, but they spread themselves among other sexual partners, they cease becoming one, and their perfect equilibrium and perfect equation is distorted and corrupted. But they have been joined together, at least as heaven and man, and let no man separate. That means not only themselves, but any institution or power or anything else. And we live in a world where the state is actively accelerating the destruction of the American family. And the answer is why? Because the state has an inexorable appetite for power. A weakened family, the non-nuclear, the non-traditional family, is actually advantageous for them because they can fill in the parental void and the role and amass more power incrementally. So they do have a lot to gain with the mass fatherlessness and the breakdown of the traditional nuclear family that we are witnessing unraveling before our very eyes as I speak to you right now. They said to him, Why then did Moses command to give a certificate of divorce and to put her away? So the certificate of the verse we read of in the third or fourth verse of the same chapter in the book of Deuteronomy, where the law is outlined and explained, and Moses wanted a written form, a written seal, to make it official, so that way a woman was not just a harlot. She did not belong to another man. She had written proof that she was no longer bound to him. It didn't work out with them. She was technically free to marry again, but she wasn't free to commit adultery or enter into any marriage or do whatever she wanted sexually. She was just the mutual sexual commitments and obligations were disbanded between her and her further husbands. Now, if they have children, that complicates things because they both have to partake in the equal distribution of raising them. He said to them, because of the hardness of your hearts, Moses allowed you to put away your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. So by the time that Moses wrote, things were a lot different than the way they were in Eden. In Eden, we had perfect, splendid paradise. Adam and Eve basked in intimate and proximate fellowship with their Maker in this lush paradise that had their every conceivable desire wanted at their disposal. No sin had not tainted into it, but there was then the world came about because of their sin. It became populated, and then laws became necessary first in the dispensation of government. This happened after the flood, after Yahweh eradicated an inexorably sinful human race, preserving one, Noah and his family, and 8. And then came the dispensation of promise. Then came the dispensation of law. Moses gave a law which was to govern these chosen people for his purpose. And in that law was the provision for divorce, because he knew that human beings were not angels. And to paraphrase our own James Madison, if human beings were angels, no government would be necessary. So because we are not angels, we have to have legal provisions for divorce. But at the beginning, it was not so. This is not commensurate with his design and intent. This is not his design or will. He wants marriage to last. He wants it to last forever, to the grave and beyond it, till death do us part and beyond. And I say to you, whoever puts away his wife, except on the grounds of whoring, and marries another, commits adultery. And whoever marries her, who has been put away, commits adultery. So adultery, even if your former sexual partner is still alive and you are indulging sexually with another person, you are essentially whoring. And the first one is that the only legitimate grounds for divorce, he endorsed Hillel's, the conservative one's, interpretation of Deuteronomy 23:1, when a woman shall displease him by polluting him. So polluting him meant sexually defiling herself through adultery. So if he put away one for any other reason and then married another, so if he endorsed Hama, the liberal one's thing, if he just divorced a wife who displeased him for some trivial reason and married another, he was guilty of adultery. And anyone who marries her who has been put away, that means divorced, commits adultery. So if you marry someone else who's been a product of it, you have to start fresh. Adulterous people are not meant to co-join, and it creates all sorts of problems when people from ruined marriage get together and decide to make it work out between them. His disciples said to him, if such is the case of the man with his wife, it is not good to marry. So in light of his monumental, exalted and lofty exaltation of the law of Moses and the institution of marriage, the disciples question, with the potentiality for divorce and the accompanying consequences and just the demands, they question whether it's worth it to begin with. What's the reason of getting married? And of course, marriage is necessary for the procreation and continuation, and is a source of blessing and joy. So we are not called to be celibate and just not do away with the institution of marriage altogether just because it has challenges and problems and dilemmas and everything doesn't work out. Everything's not supposed to work out between two separate human beings and their families all the time. That does not mean we give up on it. And he said to them, not all receive the word, but only those to whom it has given. So he's letting them know that they are privileged with access to his unique, his divine wisdom, his word, his truth, his mystery that is hidden from the world and those who believe him not. He does not share his secrets with those who reject him and scorn him and despise him as he does them. He often prefaces something similar. For there are eunuchs who are so born from their mother's womb, and there are eunuchs who were made eunuchs by men, and there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of the heaven. He who is also to receive it, let him receive it. So we read the word eunuch 3 times, and eunuchs were excluded from the fellowship and the congregation, according to the book of Deuteronomy. A eunuch was excluded, and there are 3, so they were included in the New Testament, and this really began when the Ethiopian Jewish convert, who happened to be a eunuch, he was in the employ of Candace, the king of, so he would have been a voluntary eunuch. So some people are born eunuchs, other people undergo surgical procedures which remove their genitalia. This is common in the Muslim world. They have clitoral removal, so women cannot derive physical pleasure from sex. They somehow think it makes them pure or something. But also the removal of the testicles was a common practice amongst royal courts because any one of them was a potential seducer and suitor of the royal king who could contaminate the bloodline and the progenitor of the kingdom with their seed. So it was often a requirement for them to be eunuchs, and that was the case with this man. But he also speaks of the eunuchs, the voluntary eunuchs. These are not necessarily literal eunuchs. These are ones who commit to the life of chastity. And so Joshua and Paul, they did not undergo surgical removal to remove their testicles intact. They kept their testicles under control. They kept them, but they were eunuchs. They were voluntarily chaste for the kingdom, for the spread. They were married to their work. And so they were married to the church, married to everything else. They did not have the distraction of married life. And married life is not necessarily disqualifying a factor because Paul's own advice, as he outlines the standards for ministry to his pastoral protege Timothy, is let them be a good father and good husband. So that's often a necessary prerequisite. They can prove their pastoral qualities in the home before they are entrusted to manage a larger community. But eunuchs and those who are voluntarily chaste are not disqualified either from participation or leadership in the community. Then young children were brought to him, and he lay his hands on them and pray, and the disciples rebuked him. So it would have been a common practice for Jewish rabbis. That's who Joshua was. He was a practicing Jew. He was a rabbi, not authorized, but that's what he did. He went to and fro synagogue and center in Jewish communities, and young children would have flocked and gathered to him as of any other rabbi. But the disciples, they didn't think he was worth the distraction. They knew he was busy. He was in the midst of teaching them. They didn't want them getting in the way. But Joshua said, "Allow the young children and do not stop them from coming to me, for such is the kingdom of the heaven." So he explained earlier in the earlier chapter more fully and thoroughly why they are the kingdom of heaven. We have to approach them we have to approach him as children. Hence, we should not prevent children from presenting themselves before them, because he tenderly regards them and holds them in reflection and esteem. And he really has a love, not in a creepy way, but in a very loving way for children and their innocence. And having laid his hands on them, he went from there. So the final thing he did not leave without putting his hands on their heads. That was his signal blessing and final farewell. And then we read of the famous parable of or I don't know if it's quite a parable, but the story of the rich young ruler who asks what he can do to inherit eternal life. I've done these in Mark and Luke's account. I haven't done one in Matthew's, but I might do one eventually. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.